The US dollar goes to waste. This becomes toilet paper, says Robert Kiyosaki. Author of Rich Dad, Poor Dad at Davos, Switzerland, the IMF stood and said the world economy was heading into the worst economic headwinds since World War II. Inflation in the United States has hit 4 decades of highs, with lower income households facing the worst crisis. In May, inflation hit 8.6%, the highest in 40 years. In this video, we are going to discuss how the world's only superpower is in decline now. Robert Kiyosaki shared his views on hyperinflation and the potential collapse of the US dollar. The US, the superpower, has failed to defeat Russia and Ukraine. It's failing to contain China, and it's facing dissent and rebellion in NATO. The US is losing its credibility. Its economic system is failing. Now the world is moving away from the US dollar. Dollarization accelerated at a time of rapid geopolitical change and great uncertainty. So in 1991, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, the US reigned supreme as the world's sole superpower. It has achieved ultimate success. It won the Cold War, and that's when America's slow decline began. By the mid-1990s, China had started showing signs of emerging as a major global economy. After the 2007-2008 global financial crisis hit, China began to see itself as the next superpower in waiting. And in 2013, China began its massive built-in road initiative that seeks to connect China with Africa and Europe via land and maritime networks. The BRICS is a vehicle that China hopes will allow it to surpass and eclipse the US as the world's largest economy. In 2017, US President Donald Trump announced the US withdrawal from the Paris Agreement on climate change mitigation. This undermined America's global leadership and credibility. It signaled a diminished willingness to engage and cooperate with other nations. The next year, in 2018, Donald Trump withdrew the US from the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, also known as the Iran nuclear deal, and the US reimposed economic sanctions on Iran. 3 years later, in 2021, China and Iran signed a 25-year strategic cooperation agreement in which China would invest $400 billion in Iran's economy over the time period in exchange for a steady and heavily discounted supply of oil from Iran. So the US withdrawal from the JCPOA worked in China's favor. Iran also resumed its uranium enrichment program in March of this series. It was reported to have enriched uranium up to 83.7%, which is very close to nuclear weapons-grade uranium, which is enriched to 90% or more. And Iran and China have completely bypassed the US dollar in their trade. They are now trading in the Chinese yen and the Iranian rial. Iran is now connected to Russia's payment system, the system for the transfer of financial messages, so the financial challenge channel between Iran and the rest of the world is being restored, and the US sanctions on Iran are beginning to fall now. America's global leadership, credibility and prestige took another body blow in 2021 with its chaotic and disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan. So the US essentially spent 20 years transferring power from the Taliban to the US, and in the process, they gifted the Taliban nearly $100 billion worth of high-quality military equipment. So this was an unmitigated disaster with terrible optics, reminiscent of the fall of Saigon in the spring of 1973, and possibly even worse. Now when it comes to the Middle East, Saudi ties are worsening. Saudi Arabia is considered one of the US's prime allies in the Middle East, and the Americans have gone after Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman over the Khashoggi affair. And the US is a major producer of oil as it no longer needs Saudi oil, which has also contributed to the worsening of relations. As a consequence, we have seen rapprochement between Saudis and Iranians, and both nations have credited China. So the Saudis and Iranians had not broken off diplomatic relations for quite a few years, and now they have re-established them. So now they are talking to each other, which is a significant step forward. So you have the Saudi-Iran dispute, and at the same time, we have a significant uptick and increase in the quality of relations between the Saudis and the Chinese. Now the Chinese are investing in Saudi Arabia, and they are buying large quantities of Saudi oil. The Saudis also have excellent relations with India, and now Saudi Arabia wants to become a member of BRICS. After years, America has consistently disregarded all of these laws of money. The people have reached a point where they've declared that they can no longer tolerate these violations. So, they're joining the BRICS: Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. When it comes to Saudi Arabia and China's trade, they are now trading in Chinese yen. And there's also the possibility of a rupee-rial trade between Saudi Arabia and India. Now the Arab League is moving away from the US. The Syrian government recently welcomed Bashar al-Assad, the president of Syria, back into the fold in defiance of the US. And then we have the Ukrainian war, which began in February 2022. The US threw pressure at Russia in terms of sanctions, and yet the US sanctions failed for a couple of reasons. Firstly, it is because Russia adopted the gold standard. The Russians sought the ruble for a fixed quantity of gold, 5,000 rubles for 1 gram of gold. So this turned the Russian ruble into a proxy of actual gold, and Russia has the gold reserves to back this up. Further, Russia happens to be self-sufficient in all essential resources such as oil, gas, petroleum products, iron, coal, minerals, fertilizers, agricultural products, and much more. So Russia doesn't need to import any of these items, and that's why US sanctions have not really been effective. The Ukraine conflict is now essentially a proxy war between the US and NATO on the one hand and Russia on the other. And from all accounts, we see that Russia is now in control of roughly a quarter of Ukraine, 20 to 25% of Ukraine, and the Donbass region. So once again, NATO or the US have not succeeded there. The Russians have kind of achieved some of their objectives, and Russian gas supplies to Europe have stopped. As a consequence, the Nord Stream 2 pipeline has been destroyed. Europe is now starved of cheap Russian energy, and they are now forced to purchase their oil from the US at 3 to 4 times the price that they were paying to the Russians. So the European economic engine has stalled as a consequence. Germany has entered a recession, and other European nations may be on the verge of entering a recession. The year 1923 proved to be a disaster for Germany. The Great German inflation reached its peak, so the Russians have nuclear warheads in Belarus. So that's a setback for the US, and now India and China are benefiting from an abundant super cheap Russian oil. So it's very clear when it comes to the Ukraine conflict that Russia isn't losing. The US has not succeeded in destroying the Russian economy with sanctions, and they have not succeeded in winning the Ukraine war. Global preeminence is visibly declining, and meanwhile there is trouble and dissent with NATO. So NATO is facing strains as the US has questioned the value of its commitments and demonstrated an inclination towards unilateral decisions within NATO. This has eroded trust among the NATO allies and weakened NATO's responses to the challenges it faces. While gripping a dollar bill and swaying it, Kiyosaki underscored that 70% of the global population who were once reliant on the dollar are poised to refuse this dollar bill and declare their disinterest. Kiyosaki has consistently issued various alerts concerning the possible decline of the US dollar and its position as the world's primary reserve currency. He has additionally advised that an abrupt decline could be impending, leading to the collapse of equities, bonds, and real estate markets. Amidst this bleak situation, Kiyosaki perceives a ray of hope in gold, silver, and particularly Bitcoin. In a Twitter post, Kiyosaki predicted this pivot could happen as soon as January 2023, which would see the US dollar crash in the same way as a recently collapsed British pound. Is it possible that the US dollar will mimic the British pound sterling's trajectory? Maybe yes, the US dollar will crash by January 2023 after Fed pivots, said Kiyosaki, adding he will not be a victim of the fucked Fed. Starting as far back as May 2020, Kiyosaki has advocated for asset categories that are beyond the direct influence of the Federal Reserve. He previously cautioned investors to acquire Bitcoin and safeguard yourself, subsequent to the Fed's swift and extensive money printing endeavors as a response to the COVID-19 outbreak. What do you think about the warnings by Rich Dad Poor Dad author Robert Kiyosaki? Do you agree that the American economy and or the US dollar are both declining as he suggested? Tell us what you think in the comment section below. Please share and subscribe to our channel if you like this video. Keep checking for more of these videos.